The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy's shooting range as Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her stance for the 100th time that week. The weight of the service pistol felt familiar in her hands, but the pressure weighing on her shoulders was something entirely different. 3 months. That's how long she had left before the promotion board would decide if she was worthy of becoming the youngest admiral in the Pacific Fleet's history. "Focus, Chen," she whispered to herself, her breath creating small puffs of vapor in the crisp morning air. The target stood 50 meters away, a standard bullseye that had become both her enemy and her salvation over the past year. Every morning at 0500 hours, before the academy came alive with the sounds of cadets and officers beginning their day, Sarah would stand in this exact spot and practice. The shooting range held memories that went back to her childhood. Her father, Admiral Robert Chen, had brought her here when she was just 12 years old. She could still remember the way his massive hands had guided hers, teaching her to breathe steadily, to find that perfect moment between heartbeats when everything aligned. "Shooting isn't about the gun," he had told her back then. "It's about understanding yourself, your limits, and pushing beyond them." Those words felt heavy now, especially since her father had been gone for 5 years. Cancer had taken him just as Sarah was making her mark as a rising star in the Navy. She often wondered what he would think of her now, standing on the verge of making history. Would he be proud? Would he worry that she was advancing too fast, taking on too much responsibility before she was truly ready? Sarah raised the pistol, her movements smooth and practiced. The familiar ritual began, feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, arms extended in a perfect isosceles stance. She had fired thousands of rounds from this position, but today felt different. Today, Admiral Rebecca Morrison would be watching. Admiral Morrison was a legend in the Pacific Fleet. She had broken barriers herself, becoming the first woman to command a carrier strike group in combat operations. More importantly for Sarah's future, Morrison was the head of the promotion board that would decide her fate. The informal word was that Morrison wanted to see Sarah in action before making her recommendation to the Secretary of the Navy. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Here she was, potentially the most qualified candidate for promotion in her class, and her future might hinge on something as simple as marksmanship. But she understood the symbolism. Leadership wasn't just about strategy and diplomacy, it was about precision under pressure, the ability to perform when everything was on the line. As Sarah settled into her stance, her mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her mentor, Captain James Rodriguez, the night before. They had been sitting in his office, reviewing her performance evaluations and discussing her readiness for flag rank. "You know, Sarah," Rodriguez had said, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression, "your technical qualifications are beyond question. Your leadership record speaks for itself. But there's something else the board will be looking for." "What's that, sir?" Sarah had asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Composure. The ability to perform flawlessly when the stakes are highest and all eyes are on you. Tomorrow isn't just about hitting a target. It's about proving that you can handle the pressure of command when lives depend on your decisions." Sarah had nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had commanded ships in dangerous waters, led missions that saved lives, and earned the respect of sailors who had initially been skeptical of her rapid rise through the ranks. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would be performing not for her crew or for mission success, but for her own future. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted her thoughts. Sarah lowered her weapon and turned to see Admiral Morrison approaching, accompanied by 2 other senior officers Sarah recognized from the promotion board. Morrison was an imposing figure, standing nearly 6 feet tall with silver hair pulled back in a precise bun and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Captain Chen," Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in command. "I hope you don't mind if we observe your morning routine. I believe there's value in seeing an officer in their natural element." "Of course, Admiral," Sarah replied, snapping to attention. "I was just completing my daily marksmanship practice." Morrison's eyes moved to the target downrange, then back to Sarah. "I've reviewed your qualification scores. Quite impressive. But I'm curious about something else. Tell me, what does this morning routine mean to you?" The question caught Sarah slightly off guard. She had expected to simply demonstrate her shooting and, perhaps answer a few questions about her readiness for flag rank. Instead, Morrison seemed interested in something deeper. "Ma'am, this routine represents discipline and preparation," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully. "My father taught me that excellence isn't achieved through sporadic effort, but through consistent, deliberate practice. Every morning I come here, I'm not just maintaining my marksmanship skills. I'm reinforcing the mindset that leadership requires attention to detail, persistence, and the willingness to hold yourself to the highest standards even when no one is watching." Morrison nodded slowly, and Sarah thought she detected the slightest hint of approval in the Admiral's expression. "And what about pressure, Captain? How do you perform when the stakes are raised?" "I believe pressure reveals character rather than changing it, ma'am. If you've prepared properly and know your capabilities, pressure simply clarifies your focus." "Interesting philosophy," Morrison said. "Would you be willing to demonstrate it?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression neutral. "Certainly, Admiral. What did you have in mind?" Morrison gestured toward the target. "I understand you typically fire at the 50-meter target during your morning routine. I'd like to see you engage the 100-meter target instead. 5 shots, standing position, no support." The request sent a jolt through Sarah's system. The 100-meter target was significantly more challenging, requiring not just marksmanship skill but exceptional breath control and mental focus. More importantly, it wasn't a distance she practiced regularly. Morrison wasn't just testing her shooting ability, she was evaluating how Sarah handled unexpected challenges. "Understood, ma'am," Sarah said, turning toward the more distant target. As she raised her pistol, she heard Morrison speaking quietly to her companions. "This should be interesting," the Admiral murmured. "Let's see if she's as composed under pressure as her record suggests." Sarah forced herself to block out the conversation behind her. She had faced enemy fire, commanded ships through storms that would terrify experienced sailors, and made split-second decisions that affected hundreds of lives. A marksmanship test, regardless of the observers, was just another challenge to overcome. She raised the pistol, extending her arms toward the 100-meter target. At this distance, the bullseye appeared much smaller, requiring even greater precision. Sarah began her breathing routine: slow inhale, partial exhale, hold, and fire during the natural respiratory pause. The first shot rang out across the range. Sarah couldn't see where it hit from this distance, but she felt good about the release. Smooth trigger pull, proper follow-through, minimal movement. She reset her stance and prepared for the second shot. Behind her, she could hear the officers using binoculars to observe the target. Their murmured comments were indistinct, but Sarah caught enough to know they were evaluating not just her accuracy, but her entire demeanor under observation. The second shot felt even better than the first. Sarah was finding her rhythm, settling into the zone where external distractions faded away and only the fundamentals mattered. She had learned long ago that excellence under pressure came from trusting your training and not overthinking the moment. As she prepared for the third shot, Sarah's mind briefly returned to her father's lessons. He had always emphasized that marksmanship was a metaphor for leadership. Both required the ability to remain calm under pressure, to trust your preparation, and to execute flawlessly when it mattered most. "The moment you start thinking about the consequences of missing," he had told her, "is the moment you'll miss." The third shot rang out, followed quickly by the fourth and fifth. Sarah lowered her weapon and engaged the safety, then turned to face Admiral Morrison and her companions. The senior officers were still observing the target through binoculars, their expressions unreadable. "Impressive," Morrison said finally, lowering her binoculars. 5 shots, 5 hits in the black. Not perfect center, but well within acceptable margins for that distance and conditions." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and pride, but she kept her expression neutral. She had performed well, but she sensed that the real test was just beginning. "Captain Chen," Morrison continued, "I have one more request. I'd like you to take one final shot, but this time with a slight modification to the conditions." Morrison gestured to one of her companions, who produced a small device that Sarah recognized as a stress inducer used in advanced training scenarios. The device would emit irregular sounds and lights designed to create distraction and elevate stress levels. One shot, 100 meters, with full distraction protocol, Morrison explained. This will more closely simulate the conditions under which critical decisions must be made in combat or crisis situations. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was the real test. Anyone could shoot well under ideal conditions, but leadership required the ability to perform under the worst possible circumstances. She took her position again, raising the pistol toward the distant target. The stress device activated, filling the air with jarring sounds and flashing lights designed to break concentration. Sarah forced herself to focus on her breathing, on the sight picture, on the fundamentals that had become second nature through thousands of repetitions. As she settled into her firing stance, Sarah heard Admiral Morrison speak one final time, her voice carrying clearly despite the distractions. "You'll never make that shot," Morrison called out, her tone sharp and challenging. "Not under these conditions." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she had already begun her trigger pull. Training and instinct took over, and the shot broke clean and smooth despite the verbal challenge. As the sound of the gunshot faded, Sarah lowered her weapon and turned to face the Admiral, her expression calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. What Sarah didn't know, as she stood waiting for the target evaluation, was that her shot had found its mark with precision that surprised even Admiral Morrison. More importantly, her composure under the most challenging conditions had already answered the questions the promotion board needed answered. But the real story was just beginning, and the consequences of this moment would ripple through both women's lives in ways neither could imagine. The shot had been fired, the target had been hit, but the true test of leadership was yet to come. In the silence that followed, as binoculars were raised to evaluate the target, Saracen stood quietly, unaware that she had just taken the first step toward changing not just her own destiny, but the entire future of the Pacific Fleet. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting new shadows across the range, and, somewhere in the distance, a new chapter in military history was about to begin. 3 hours after the shooting demonstration, Saracen sat in the Academy's conference room, watching Admiral Morrison review a thick folder that contained her complete service record. The target from the morning's test lay on the table between them, a single hole punched precisely through the center of the bullseye. The shot Morrison had declared impossible had found its mark with accuracy that defied the challenging conditions. "Captain Chen," Morrison began, closing the folder and fixing Sarah with an intense stare, "in 35 years of naval service, I've seen exactly 3 officers demonstrate that level of composure under pressure. 2 of them went on to become some of the most decorated commanders in fleet history. The third one died in combat, saving the lives of 400 sailors when his ship was attacked." Sarah remained silent, understanding that Morrison was building toward something significant. The Admiral's weathered hands traced the edge of the target, her fingers pausing over the bullet hole. "What I witnessed this morning wasn't just exceptional marksmanship," Morrison continued. "It was a demonstration of the mindset that separates competent officers from transformational leaders. When I challenged you at that critical moment, when I told you that you'd never make that shot, you had already committed to the action. Lesser officers would have hesitated, second-guessed themselves, or allowed doubt to creep in. You trusted your training and executed flawlessly." The praise felt surreal to Sarah. She had grown up hearing stories about Admiral Morrison's legendary standards and exacting requirements for excellence. Officers throughout the fleet spoke of Morrison's evaluations in hushed tones, knowing that her approval could make careers while her disapproval could end them just as quickly. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied. "I learned early that doubt is the enemy of execution. Once you've committed to a course of action based on proper preparation and sound judgment, hesitation only increases the likelihood of failure." Morrison nodded, but her expression remained serious. "That philosophy will serve you well in the role we're considering for you. However, I need you to understand something about what lies ahead. The promotion board has already made its decision regarding your advancement to flag rank. You will be promoted to Rear Admiral, making you the youngest person to achieve that rank in Pacific Fleet history." Sarah felt the world shift around her. The goal she had worked toward for her entire career was suddenly within reach, but Morrison's tone suggested that celebration might be premature. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Your first assignment as Admiral will be unique. The Navy is facing challenges that require unconventional solutions, and the Pentagon has identified you as someone capable of thinking beyond traditional approaches. You're being assigned to lead a joint task force that will address emerging threats in the South Pacific." The Admiral paused, studying Sarah's reaction. "This isn't a ceremonial position or a stepping stone to larger commands. You'll be given real authority to make decisions that could affect regional stability and American strategic interests. The task force will include assets from multiple branches of the military, allied nations, and civilian intelligence agencies. Success could establish you as one of the most influential military leaders of your generation. Failure could end your career and, potentially, compromise American security in the region." Sarah absorbed the magnitude of what Morrison was describing. She had expected a challenging first assignment as a flag officer, but this sounded like something typically reserved for officers with decades of experience at the admiral level. "Ma'am, may I ask why the Pentagon has chosen someone with my limited experience for such a significant responsibility?" Morrison's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been admiration. "Because traditional approaches aren't working, Captain. The threats we're facing in the South Pacific are evolving faster than our conventional responses can adapt. We need leaders who can think creatively, act decisively, and inspire confidence in both our own forces and our allies. Your record demonstrates all of those qualities." The Admiral opened another folder, revealing satellite images and intelligence reports that Sarah couldn't fully process from her position across the table. "The situation is more complex than what's been reported in public briefings. We're dealing with aggressive territorial expansion, cyber warfare, advanced missile systems, and coordinated efforts to undermine American influence in the region. The previous task force commander requested reassignment after 8 months, citing the impossibility of achieving meaningful progress with current resources and protocols." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the conference room's air conditioning. Morrison was describing a situation where failure might be the most likely outcome, regardless of the officer in command. "What makes the Pentagon think a different approach will yield better results?" "Your background," Morrison replied immediately. "You've commanded vessels in joint operations, you speak 3 languages relevant to the region, and you have a proven ability to build relationships with allied commanders who initially viewed you with skepticism. More importantly, you've demonstrated creative problem-solving abilities that older, more traditional officers often lack." Morrison leaned forward, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "Sarah, I'm going to share something with you that isn't in any official record. Your father and I served together early in our careers. He was one of the most innovative tactical minds I ever encountered, but he was also constrained by the conventional thinking of his era. He often spoke about his hope that future generations of naval officers would have the freedom to implement solutions that his generation could only imagine." The mention of her father caught Sarah off guard. She had known that Morrison and her father had served together, but she hadn't realized the depth of their professional relationship or that her father had discussed his hopes for the future of naval strategy. "Admiral Morrison, are you suggesting that this assignment is somehow connected to my father's ideas about naval strategy?" "I'm suggesting that the challenges we face today require exactly the kind of innovative thinking your father advocated but couldn't fully implement. The task force you'll be commanding has been given unprecedented autonomy to develop new approaches to deterrence, alliance building, and crisis response. You'll have resources and authority that previous commanders could only dream of, but you'll also be operating in an environment where traditional rules of engagement may not apply." Morrison stood up and moved to the conference room's large window, which offered a view of the harbor where several naval vessels were anchored. "Let me be completely transparent with you, Sarah. This assignment could be career suicide. If you're not successful, the failure will be highly visible, and there won't be many opportunities to recover from it. However, if you succeed, you'll be positioned to influence American naval strategy for decades to come." The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. She had always been ambitious, driven by a desire to make a meaningful contribution to naval service and to honor her father's legacy. But this opportunity came with risks that could destroy everything she had worked to achieve.
Ma'am, how much time do I have to consider the assignment?
Morrison turned from the window, her expression serious.
You don't.
The assignment is effective immediately upon your promotion, which will occur next Friday. The task force is already being assembled, and your presence is required in Hawaii by the end of next week. The rapid timeline added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming situation. Sarah had expected some transition period between promotion and assignment, time to adjust to flag rank responsibilities before taking on a major command.
Instead, she was being thrown directly into what sounded like one of the most challenging assignments in the Pacific Fleet. Admiral, may I ask about the composition of the task force?
You mentioned multiple branches and allied nations. Morrison returned to her seat and opened yet another folder. The naval component includes a carrier strike group, 2 submarine squadrons, and various support vessels. The Air Force is providing strategic bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. The Marines have contributed a full expeditionary unit. Additionally, you'll be working closely with Australian, Japanese, and South Korean naval forces, each operating under their own national command structures while coordinating through your headquarters. The scope of the operation was staggering. Sarah had commanded individual ships and small task groups, but this assignment would require coordinating resources and personnel on a scale she had never experienced.
The political and diplomatic complexities alone would be challenging enough without the added pressure of operational success. The most challenging aspect, Morrison continued, will be the intelligence component. You'll be working with analysts and operatives from multiple agencies, some of whom have conflicting interpretations of the threats we're facing. Part of your job will be synthesizing those different perspectives into actionable intelligence that can guide tactical decisions. Sarah could feel the magnitude of the responsibility settling over her like a heavy blanket. Every aspect of the assignment seemed designed to test capabilities she had never fully developed. Leadership at this level wasn't just about military tactics and strategy, it was about diplomacy, intelligence analysis, inter-service cooperation, and international relations. Admiral Morrison, I have to ask, given the risks and the complexity of this assignment, why would the Navy offer it to someone they consider too valuable to lose? Wouldn't it make more sense to assign a more expendable officer to what you've described as a potential career-ending mission? Morrison's laugh held no humor. Because, Sarah, we're not looking for someone expendable.
We're looking for someone capable of achieving what others have considered impossible.
The Pentagon's assessment is that conventional approaches have already failed. We need someone who can succeed where others have not. The Admiral paused, studying Sarah's face. I'll be honest with you.
There were heated discussions about this assignment. Some senior officers argued that putting someone with your limited flag rank experience in this position was reckless.
Others contended that your unconventional background and demonstrated abilities made you the only viable candidate. And where did you stand in those discussions, ma'am?
I argued that your performance under pressure, combined with your innovative thinking and relationship-building abilities, made you worth the risk.
This morning's demonstration confirmed my assessment.
When I challenged you at that critical moment, when I told you that you'd never make that shot, you had already proven you could handle pressure that would break other officers. Sarah realized that Morrison's challenge during the shooting test had been more than just a stress evaluation. It had been a final confirmation that Sarah possessed the psychological resilience necessary for the assignment ahead. Admiral, assuming I accept this assignment, you will accept it, Morrison interrupted firmly.
This isn't a request, Captain. This is your assignment as a newly promoted Rear Admiral.
The question isn't whether you'll take the job, but how you'll approach it. The finality in Morrison's voice removed any illusion that Sarah had a choice in the matter. She was being handed an opportunity that could define her career, but she was also being placed in a position where failure could destroy it just as quickly.
Then, I suppose my question is about preparation time.
What resources will be available to help me understand the full scope of the situation before I assume command? Morrison smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. You'll have a full briefing team waiting for you in Hawaii, including intelligence analysts who have been tracking these developments for months. You'll also have access to the previous task force commander's complete records, including his assessment of why conventional approaches weren't successful.
The Admiral closed the folders and gathered them into a neat stack. Sarah, I want you to understand something. This assignment isn't just about your career or even about American interests in the South Pacific.
The decisions you make and the precedents you set will influence how the Navy approaches complex international challenges for years to come. You're not just being asked to command a task force, you're being asked to help define the future of naval strategy. As Morrison prepared to leave, she turned back to Sarah one final time. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished and excited about what lies ahead. He always believed that the Navy's greatest strength was its ability to adapt and innovate when faced with new challenges.
You're about to have the opportunity to prove him right.
After Morrison left, Sarah remained alone in the conference room, staring at the target with its single, perfectly placed shot. The hole in the center of the bullseye seemed to symbolize both her greatest triumph and her most daunting challenge. She had proven she could perform under pressure, but the real test was still ahead. Outside the window, the harbor bustled with activity as ships prepared for deployment and crews conducted training exercises. Soon, Sarah would be responsible for coordinating activities on a scale that dwarfed anything visible from this conference room.
The weight of that responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying.
As she finally stood to leave, Sarah thought about her father's lessons regarding pressure and performance. The moment you start thinking about the consequences of missing, he had told her, is the moment you'll miss. Now, faced with the most important assignment of her career, Sarah realized that the same principle would apply to everything she did as a flag officer.
The shot had been fired, the target had been hit, and now the real work was about to begin.
The humidity hit Sarah like a wall as she stepped off the transport aircraft at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii in August was always challenging for those accustomed to more temperate climates, but the heat felt particularly oppressive as she contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead. Her promotion ceremony had taken place just 48 hours earlier, a brief affair attended by her closest colleagues and a few senior officers who wanted to witness history. Now, less than a week after Admiral Morrison's shooting range challenge, Sarah found herself walking toward the headquarters building that would serve as the nerve center for the most complex military operation she had ever imagined. Captain Rodriguez had accompanied her to Hawaii, serving as both her advisor and her connection to the network of relationships that would be crucial for success.
As they walked across the sprawling naval base, Rodriguez provided a running commentary on the various assets Sarah would be commanding.
The USS Gerald Ford arrived yesterday, Rodriguez explained, pointing toward the massive aircraft carrier that dominated the harbor. She's the centerpiece of your strike group, with over 70 aircraft and a crew of 5,000. The captain, Jennifer Walsh, has been briefed on the mission parameters, but she's expressing concerns about operating in such a politically sensitive environment. Sarah nodded, understanding that Walsh's concerns were likely shared by many of the officers who would be serving under her command. Experienced military leaders understood that complex political situations could turn routine operations into international incidents with frightening speed.
What about the submarine component? Sarah asked, reviewing the briefing materials she had been studying during the flight.
2 Los Angeles-class submarines and 1 Virginia-class boat, Rodriguez replied. They've been conducting reconnaissance operations in the area for the past month, gathering intelligence on underwater installations and monitoring communications traffic. The sub-commanders are reporting activity patterns that don't match any known military exercises or civilian operations.
The mention of unusual activity patterns sent a chill through Sarah despite the tropical heat.
Intelligence reports could be interpreted in many ways, but experienced submarine commanders rarely reported anomalies unless they represented genuine concerns. Whatever was happening in the South Pacific had captured the attention of some of the most skilled intelligence-gathering assets in the American military. As they approached the headquarters building, Sarah could see the full scope of the international cooperation Morrison had described. Flags from Australia, Japan, and South Korea flew alongside the American standard, and personnel in various uniforms moved between buildings with the purposeful efficiency that characterized major military operations.
Admiral Chen called a voice from behind them.
Sarah turned to see a tall man in an Air Force uniform approaching with an outstretched hand.
Colonel Michael Thompson, Air Force Liaison for the task force.
I wanted to welcome you to Pearl Harbor and brief you on our aviation assets.
Thompson's handshake was firm, and his direct manner suggested someone accustomed to dealing with complex operational requirements.
Sarah had worked with Air Force personnel before, but never at this level of integration between service branches. Colonel Thompson, I appreciate your prompt introduction.
What's the current status of air assets?
We have B-2 strategic bombers rotating through Guam, along with reconnaissance aircraft that have been monitoring the region for the past 6 weeks. Additionally, we're coordinating with Japanese and Australian air forces for surveillance and rapid response capabilities.
The challenge we're facing is the sheer geographic scope of the area we're trying to monitor.
Thompson produced a tablet displaying a map of the South Pacific that illustrated the scale of the problem Sarah was inheriting. Red markers indicated areas of concern, while blue symbols represented Allied assets. The ratio of problems to resources was daunting even at first glance.
Colonel, based on your assessment, what are our biggest intelligence gaps?
Underwater installations, Thompson replied immediately. We know something is being constructed on the seafloor in multiple locations, but we can't determine the purpose or the full extent of these activities. Our submarine assets are providing valuable information, but the installations are heavily defended and difficult to approach without risking detection. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another officer, this one wearing the uniform of the Australian Navy.
Admiral Chen, the newcomer said in an accent that confirmed his nationality, Captain David Mitchell, Royal Australian Navy.
I've been serving as the Allied Coordination Officer, and I wanted to welcome you to what has become a very interesting assignment.
Mitchell's tone suggested that interesting was a diplomatic understatement for whatever challenges the task force had been facing.
Sarah appreciated directness from Allied officers, as it indicated a level of trust and professional respect that would be crucial for success. Captain Mitchell, I'm eager to hear your assessment of Allied cooperation and any concerns your government might have about current operations. Our concerns are primarily about escalation, Mitchell replied candidly. The activities we're monitoring have the potential to destabilize the entire region if they're not addressed properly. However, overly aggressive responses could trigger exactly the kind of confrontation we're trying to avoid. It's a delicate balance between showing strength and maintaining stability. Sarah understood that Mitchell was describing the central challenge of her assignment. Military leaders were trained to project strength and deter aggression, but the political complexities of the South Pacific required a more nuanced approach.
Success would require finding ways to address threats without triggering larger conflicts.
Gentlemen, I'd like to convene a full briefing in 1 hour, Sarah announced. I want to hear from every component commander and get a complete picture of our current situation before we discuss any changes to operational approaches.
As the officers dispersed to prepare for the briefing, Sarah and Rodriguez made their way into the headquarters building.
The interior was a maze of cubicles, conference rooms, and communication centers that hummed with activity. Analysts studied satellite images on large screens while communication specialists maintained contact with assets spread across thousands of miles of ocean. Sarah, Rodriguez said quietly as they walked toward her temporary office, there's something I need to tell you before you meet with the previous task force commander.
Admiral Stevens didn't just request reassignment because the mission was challenging.
He was specifically concerned about what he considered inadequate guidance from Washington regarding rules of engagement. The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Rules of engagement were critical for any military operation, but they became absolutely crucial when dealing with situations that could escalate into international incidents. If Stevens had been operating without clear guidance, it explained why conventional approaches had been unsuccessful. How specific were his concerns? He felt that the Pentagon was asking him to achieve deterrent effects without providing clear authority to take the actions necessary to achieve those effects. Essentially, he was being asked to project strength while being constrained from demonstrating that strength in meaningful ways. Sarah paused outside her office door, understanding the impossible position Stevens had been placed in. Military deterrence depended on credible demonstrations of capability and resolve. If commanders were constrained from making those demonstrations, deterrent effects became nearly impossible to achieve.
Has anything changed regarding rules of engagement since Stevens' departure? That's what you'll need to determine, Rodriguez replied.
Your briefing materials include the latest guidance from Washington, but interpreting that guidance in specific operational situations will be your responsibility.
Sarah entered her office to find Admiral Stevens waiting for her.
He was a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s whose expression suggested someone who had recently experienced significant frustration with his assignment.
Admiral Chen, Stevens said, standing to shake her hand.
I want to welcome you to what is simultaneously the most important and most impossible assignment in the Pacific Fleet.
Stevens' directness was refreshing, even if his assessment was discouraging. Sarah had expected to inherit challenges, but Stevens' characterization suggested problems that went beyond typical operational difficulties. Admiral Stevens, I appreciate your willingness to brief me personally. What would you identify as the primary obstacles to success?
Stevens gestured toward a chair and settled into his own seat behind the desk that would soon be Sarah's. The primary obstacle is the mismatch between what Washington wants us to accomplish and what they're willing to authorize us to do. We're facing an adversary that is systematically testing our resolve and our capabilities, but our responses are constrained by political considerations that don't account for the realities of the situation. The Admiral opened a thick folder filled with operational reports and intelligence assessments.
Let me give you a specific example.
3 weeks ago, our reconnaissance aircraft detected the construction of what appears to be a missile installation on an artificial island that wasn't there 6 months ago. The installation is clearly designed to threaten shipping lanes that are vital to Allied commerce and military operations.
Stevens paused, studying Sarah's reaction.
Our response options were limited to diplomatic protests and enhanced surveillance. We weren't authorized to conduct close reconnaissance, to interfere with construction activities, or to demonstrate our capability to neutralize the installation if necessary. The result was that construction continued unabated, and we're now facing a more advanced threat than we were 3 weeks ago. The example illustrated exactly the kind of constraints that would make deterrence impossible. Sarah could understand why Stevens had requested reassignment rather than continue operating under such restrictions.
Have the rules of engagement been modified since that incident? Not in any meaningful way, Stevens replied.
You'll have slightly more flexibility than I did, but you'll still be operating under constraints that may prevent you from taking the actions necessary to achieve deterrent effects.
Stevens leaned forward, his expression serious. Sarah, I want you to understand something. This isn't about my inability to handle difficult assignments.
I've commanded in combat situations where the rules of engagement were clear and the mission objectives were achievable.
This situation is different because the constraints are political rather than operational. The distinction Stevens was drawing highlighted a fundamental challenge that Sarah had not fully anticipated.
She had prepared for complex military operations and difficult diplomatic situations, but Stevens was describing a scenario where political considerations might prevent effective military action altogether.
Admiral, what would you do differently if you were in my position?
Stevens was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I would establish very clear communication with Washington about what can and cannot be achieved under current constraints. If the Pentagon wants deterrent effects, they need to authorize the actions that create those effects. If political considerations prevent such authorization, then mission objectives need to be adjusted to reflect what's actually possible. The advice was sound, but Sarah could see the political minefield it represented.
Requesting expanded authority could be interpreted as aggressive or insubordinate, while accepting current constraints might guarantee failure. Finding the right balance would require diplomatic skills that weren't typically part of military training. How have Allied commanders reacted to these constraints?
With growing frustration, Stevens admitted.
Australian and Japanese commanders are particularly concerned because their nations face the most direct threats from the installations we're monitoring. They're beginning to question American commitment to regional security if we're unwilling to take meaningful action to address obvious threats.
The erosion of Allied confidence represented a strategic threat that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. American influence in the South Pacific depended on Ally trust in American capabilities and resolve.
If that trust was undermined, the geopolitical consequences could be severe. Stevens stood up and moved toward the door.
Sarah, you're an exceptional officer with capabilities that I frankly lack.
It's possible that you'll find solutions that weren't apparent to me.
However, I want you to understand the magnitude of what you're inheriting.
This isn't just about military tactics and strategy. It's about navigating political complexities that may not have solutions within current parameters. After Stevens left, Sarah remained in the office, studying the intelligence reports and operational assessments that covered every surface.
The scope of the challenges was even greater than Morrison had described, and